The phone call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Sarah Whitaker almost let it go to voicemail. She had 3 children to get ready for school, a thermos of coffee that had already gone cold on the kitchen counter, and the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from working 2 jobs and still falling behind on rent. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and she nearly thumbed the red button on instinct. Something stopped her. Maybe it was the way her youngest, Lily, was singing to herself in the living room, or the way the morning light slanted through the curtains in a way that reminded her of her grandmother's old farmhouse. Whatever it was, she answered. The voice on the other end belonged to a notary named Mr. Pemberton, and what he said next would unravel everything Sarah thought she knew about her family, her grandmother, and the small, quiet life she had been struggling to keep together. He said her grandmother had left her a house. Not money, not a savings bond. A house. A 2-story Victorian on the outskirts of a town called Briarcliff, for hours north of where Sarah lived in a cramped rental apartment with peeling wallpaper and a heater that worked when it felt like it. The deed, Mr. Pemberton explained, had been signed over to Sarah specifically, not to her mother, not to her aunt, not to any of the cousins who had spent the past decade trying to figure out what Grandma Eleanor had been hiding in those last lonely years before she passed. Sarah sat down on the edge of her kitchen chair, the one with the wobbly leg she kept meaning to fix. The phone felt heavy against her ear. Mr. Pemberton was still talking, his voice patient and measured, walking her through the legalities of it all. The taxes had been paid up through the end of the year by the estate. The keys were waiting at his office. The house had been sitting empty for almost 11 months, ever since Grandma Eleanor had been moved into hospice care, and there were some conditions in the will that Sarah needed to understand. Conditions. That word stuck in her throat like a piece of dry bread. Sarah was 29 years old. She had been raising her 3 kids alone since her husband Daniel walked out 4 years ago with a duffel bag and a vague promise to send child support that never materialized. She knew about conditions. She knew about the fine print that always turned a good thing into something harder. She asked Mr. Pemberton what kind of conditions. He cleared his throat and said that the will specified the house could not be sold for at least 12 months from the date of inheritance. Sarah had to live in it or maintain it during that time. After 12 months, she was free to do whatever she wanted with it. But for 1 full year, the house had to remain in her name, occupied or at least cared for. Sarah closed her eyes. A house. A whole house. With a yard, probably. With more than 2 bedrooms. With walls that weren't water-stained and floors that didn't slope toward the middle. She thought about her oldest, Marcus, who was 8, and how he had been asking for months if he could have his own room instead of sharing with his little sister. She thought about Lily, for years old, who had started waking up at night because she heard the upstairs neighbors fighting through the thin walls. She thought about her middle child, 6-year-old Emma, who had drawn a picture of their family standing in front of a real house with a real roof and a real chimney, and had taped it to the refrigerator like a wish. The catch, of course, was that Sarah's life was nailed down here. Her jobs were here. Marcus's school was here, the one she had fought to get him into because they had a program for kids with reading difficulties. Her car, a 2003 Honda with 230,000 miles on it, was held together with prayers and duct tape and would barely survive the drive to Briarcliff, let alone the constant back and forth. Moving meant uprooting everything. It meant starting over in a town she had only visited a handful of times as a child. It meant gambling on a house she had never seen the inside of, left to her by a grandmother she had loved but barely known in any real way. And yet, she heard herself telling Mr. Pemberton that she would come. She would drive up that weekend. She would look at the house, take the keys, and figure out what to do from there. She hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen for a long time, listening to Lily sing and to the radiator clanking in the wall, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, her grandmother had known something she didn't. Maybe Eleanor had seen the way Sarah's life was bending under the weight of everything and decided to leave her something more solid than memories. She told the kids about it that night over a dinner of boxed macaroni and cheese with cut-up hot dogs. Marcus wanted to know if the house had stairs. Emma wanted to know if there was a tree she could climb. Lily wanted to know if Grandma Eleanor would be there, and Sarah had to explain, again, that Grandma Eleanor had gone to be with the angels. Lily nodded like she had been told this many times, which she had, and then asked if there would be a bathtub. There would be, Sarah told her. There would almost certainly be a bathtub. She didn't tell them yet that she was thinking about moving. She didn't want to put that into their heads until she had seen the place for herself. There were too many ways this could go wrong. The house might be falling apart. The roof might be caving in. The pipes might be frozen and burst. She had inherited problems before, dressed up as opportunities. She wasn't going to make that mistake again, not with 3 kids depending on her. That Saturday, she packed a thermos of coffee, a peanut butter sandwich for the road, and a notebook to write down everything she observed. She dropped the kids off with her best friend Marisol, who lived 2 floors down and had been her lifeline for the past 4 years. Marisol hugged her at the door and told her to drive safe and to call the second she got there. Sarah promised she would. The drive north took her out of the city and into countryside she hadn't seen in years. Past the suburbs, past the strip malls, past the last of the chain restaurants, and into a stretch of road lined with farms and stone walls and barns that leaned slightly to the side. The leaves had just started to turn, and the hills were splashed with red and gold and the deep, dark green of pines. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. She rolled down the window and let the cold autumn air rush in. She turned up the radio. For an hour, she didn't think about rent or bills or her ex-husband or the fact that she had cried in the bathroom of her second job last Tuesday because a customer had thrown a coffee at her. Briarcliff, when she finally reached it, was smaller than she remembered. The main street had 1 stoplight, a hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, and a post office with American flags hanging from the porch. She passed all of it in less than a minute and kept driving, following the directions Mr. Pemberton had given her. The road narrowed and started to climb. Trees pressed in on both sides. She drove past a stone bridge over a creek, past a stretch of fence with a grazing horse looking up curiously at her car, past a mailbox shaped like a barn. And then, around a bend, she saw it. The house. It was tall and narrow and painted a faded blue that had been white once. It had a wraparound porch with a sagging swing, a gable roof with 2 chimneys, and a turret on the left side that gave it the look of a small, dignified castle. The yard was overgrown, the grass nearly knee-high, and the bushes along the foundation had grown wild and were threatening to swallow the porch steps. The driveway was gravel, mostly washed away by years of rain. Sarah parked the Honda and just sat there for a minute, staring. It was bigger than she had pictured. It was prettier, in a worn-out, neglected kind of way. It was the kind of house that, with a little love, could become the home she had been drawing in her head since she was a little girl. It was also, she could already see, the kind of house that would eat money like a furnace. The paint was peeling. One of the porch columns had a crack running through it. The roof had a section of missing shingles. But it was hers. It was hers, and she had a year to figure out what to do with it. She got out of the car and walked up the path. The porch boards groaned under her feet. She pulled the key Mr. Pemberton had given her out of her pocket. It was a heavy brass key, old-fashioned, the kind you don't see anymore, with a tag attached that read simply, "Front Door." The lock turned with a satisfying click. The door swung inward, and Sarah stepped into her grandmother's house for the first time in 17 years. The air smelled like cedar and old paper and a faint trace of something floral, maybe potpourri that had long since lost its scent. The front hallway opened into a sitting room on the right and a dining room on the left. There were sheets draped over most of the furniture, like a movie set waiting for actors. Sarah pulled one of them off and saw a velvet sofa underneath, the color of dark wine, with embroidered cushions piled at one end. The hardwood floor under her feet was scratched but solid. The walls were papered in a pattern of pale blue flowers that had faded to gray in patches. She walked slowly through the rooms, pulling sheets off furniture, taking inventory. A grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:14. A bookshelf full of leather-bound volumes. A china cabinet with a tea set inside that Sarah recognized vaguely from childhood. A piano in the corner of the sitting room, its lid closed, dust thick on the keys. She tried not to think about how much any of it might be worth. She tried not to think about it because thinking about it felt like circling a vulture over her grandmother's memory, and Sarah was not that kind of person. She found the kitchen at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over a vegetable garden gone to weeds. There was an old gas stove, a porcelain sink, and a wooden table with 4 chairs. A calendar on the wall was still turned to November of the year before, with a doctor's appointment circled in red pen. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She moved on. The downstairs had a small powder room, a pantry full of dusty mason jars, and a door at the end of the hallway that led to a basement she decided to save for later. Upstairs, she counted 4 bedrooms. 4. One of them was clearly her grandmother's, the largest, with a 4-poster bed and a vanity table and a closet that still held her clothes. Sarah stood in the doorway and didn't go inside. It felt too soon. The other 3 bedrooms were smaller but comfortable. One had wallpaper with little birds on it. Another had built-in bookshelves. A third had a window seat that overlooked the backyard. Sarah stood in that room for a long time, picturing Marcus reading on the window seat, picturing Emma climbing the maple tree she could see through the glass, picturing Lily picking flowers from the overgrown garden. She felt something crack open inside her chest, something she had kept clamped shut for years, and she sat down on the floor of the empty bedroom and cried for 10 minutes straight. When she finally got herself together, she wiped her face and went back. Downstairs, she walked through the rooms again, slower this time, and she made the decision that would change everything. She was going to move. She was going to take her kids out of that cramped apartment with its angry neighbors and its bad heater. She was going to bring them here, to this old, tired, beautiful house, and they were going to make it work. She didn't know how. She didn't have the money for repairs. She didn't have a job lined up in Briarcliff. She didn't even know if her car would make the drive without dying. But she was going to do it. Because for the first time in years, she had been handed something her grandmother had wanted her to have. And she wasn't going to throw that away. She locked up the house that afternoon and drove back home with her hands tight on the steering wheel and her plans spinning in her head. She told the kids that night, and they exploded with such joy that Lily ran around the apartment with a kitchen towel tied around her neck like a cape, shouting that they were moving to a castle. Marisol cried when Sarah told her. They drank cheap wine on the fire escape and made a list of everything Sarah would need to do. Find a new job. Transfer Marcus's school records. Pack up the apartment. Break the lease, which, thankfully, was already month to month. Sarah barely slept that night, and the night after, and the night after that. 2 weeks later, she was loading the last of their belongings into a borrowed U-Haul and saying goodbye to the only home her younger 2 kids had ever known. The drive north was harder this time, with the kids in the back of the truck cab and a trailer full of furniture rattling behind them. Lily got carsick twice. Emma asked every 15 minutes if they were there yet. Marcus stared out the window and asked Sarah quietly, when they were about an hour out, if she was sure about this. Sarah looked at her eldest son and saw the way he had grown up too fast, the way he had taken on the role of the little man of the house ever since his father left. She squeezed his knee and told him she was sure. She wasn't, not completely, but she told him she was. Sometimes a mother had to be sure for both of them. The moment they pulled into the driveway of the blue Victorian, the kids went silent. They piled out of the truck and stood on the gravel, staring up at the house. Lily was the first to speak. She said it was the biggest house in the whole world. Emma said there was a tree she could climb, just like she had wanted. Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. Then he turned to Sarah and asked which bedroom he could have. Sarah told him he could pick. He ran for the porch. The first few weeks in the house were the hardest. The electricity was on, thanks to Mr. Pemberton's efforts on her behalf, but the heating system was ancient and temperamental. The hot water heater leaked. The toilet on the second floor ran constantly. One of the kitchen windows was cracked, and the cold autumn wind whistled through it at night. Sarah patched what she could, learned what she couldn't, and made calls to a handful of local handymen who quoted her prices that made her chest tight. She took a job at the diner in town, the one she had passed on her first drive up, and the owner, a kind woman named Patty, let her bring Lily with her on the mornings the older kids were at school. Sarah waited tables from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, came home, made the kids a snack, helped them with homework, and then started in on whatever the house needed. She painted walls. She scrubbed floors. She learned how to use a caulking gun. Her hands grew rough. Her back ached every night. She didn't have the money for half of what the house needed, but she did what she could with what she had. And little by little, the house started to feel like theirs. The kids adjusted faster than she had any right to hope for. Marcus made a friend at his new school, a boy named Theo who lived on the next property over and who showed up one Saturday with his bike and an offer to teach Marcus how to fish in the creek. Emma got obsessed with the maple tree in the backyard and spent every dry afternoon climbing it. Lily found a sunny spot in the dining room where she liked to color, and she filled the walls with her drawings, taped up with the kind of permission Sarah had never been able to give her in the apartment. At night, when the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah would sometimes wander through the rooms with a cup of tea, just looking, just feeling. There was something about the house that pulled at her, some sense of history settling into her bones. She would stop in front of the grandfather clock, which she had wound up and gotten ticking again, and she would put her hand on its wooden case and feel like she was touching something her grandmother had touched. She would stand in the kitchen, where Eleanor had presumably cooked thousands of meals, and she would imagine her younger self running through the doorway with sticky fingers and asking for cookies. The memories were faded, but they were there, and the house knew them better than Sarah did. It was 6 weeks into living there that Sarah finally felt ready to go through her grandmother's bedroom. She had been putting it off, partly out of respect and partly out of a kind of grief she hadn't expected. But the kids needed more storage space, and Eleanor's room was the largest, and Sarah had been sleeping in the smaller bedroom across the hall because she couldn't bring herself to touch the four-poster bed. One Sunday afternoon, while the kids were at Theo's house for a birthday party, Sarah took a deep breath and went in. The room was exactly as it had been the day Eleanor had been taken to hospice. A nightgown was folded on the foot of the bed. A pair of slippers was tucked under the chair. A glass of water on the nightstand had long since evaporated, leaving a dusty ring on the wood. Sarah moved slowly, methodically. She emptied the closet first, sorting Eleanor's dresses and coats into piles for donation, for keeping, for figuring out later. She found a wedding photograph in a hat box, her grandmother and grandfather young and beaming, and she set it aside to frame. She found a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, which she set aside without reading because they felt too private. She found a small jewelry box with a broken hinge that contained a string of pearls, a wedding ring, and a locket with a tiny photograph of a baby Sarah didn't recognize. By the time she got to the vanity table, she was exhausted, dust-covered, and emotionally wrung out. She sat down on the little upholstered stool and looked at herself in the mirror that hung above the vanity. It was a beautiful mirror, framed in dark wood carved with leaves and flowers, oval-shaped, with the kind of gentle warp that old glass develops over time. Sarah's reflection looked tired and sad, and a little ghostly in the dim afternoon light. She started opening drawers. The first one held hair clips and bobby pins. The second held perfume bottles, some still half full, the scents long turned. The third held a small leather-bound journal with a strap that buckled around it. Sarah hesitated. She thought about her grandmother's privacy. She thought about the fact that her grandmother was gone now, and the journal was as much a part of the estate as the house itself. She thought about how she might never understand why Eleanor had left everything to her, and that maybe the journal held some answers. She unbuckled the strap. She opened the journal. The first page was dated more than 20 years ago, and the handwriting was unmistakably her grandmother's. The entry read simply, "The mirror has been moved. They mustn't find what's behind it. Not yet. Not ever, if I can help it." Sarah stared at the page. She read it again, slower. She turned to the next page, and the next, and her grandmother's spidery script described, over the course of many entries, a fear so deep and so old that Sarah could almost feel it rising off the paper like steam. There were references to people Sarah didn't know, names that meant nothing to her. There were dates, careful and precise. There were sketches in the margins, little diagrams that looked like floor plans. And there was, over and over again, mention of the mirror. The mirror in the bedroom. The mirror that was not just a mirror. The mirror that was, according to Eleanor, hiding something that no one in the family was supposed to know about. Sarah closed the journal. She set it down on the vanity. She looked up at her own reflection, framed by carved leaves and flowers, and she stared at the mirror like she had never seen it before. Because, she realized, maybe she hadn't. Maybe none of them had. The afternoon light shifted, and the mirror caught it and threw a faint shimmer back into the room. Sarah stood up slowly. She walked closer. She put her hand on the frame, on the smooth, cool wood, and she felt the weight of it. The mirror was heavier than it looked. The frame was deep, almost too deep for a piece of wall art. She pressed her ear against the glass, half feeling foolish, and listened. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock downstairs and the faint sound of wind through the maple tree outside. She stepped back. She picked up the journal. She read 3 more entries. Then she put the journal in her pocket and went downstairs and made herself a cup of coffee with hands that were shaking just slightly. She didn't go back upstairs that night. She picked the kids up from Theo's house. She made them dinner. She got Lily into the bathtub and washed her hair and dried her off and put her into pajamas with little ducks printed on them. She read Emma a chapter from the book they were working through. She told Marcus he could stay up an extra half hour to finish the model airplane he was building on the dining room table. And the whole time, she felt the journal in her back pocket like a small, hot stone. After the kids were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table and read the entire journal cover to cover. It took her almost 3 hours. By the end, she understood 3 things, and none of them made the rest of the night any easier. The first thing she understood was that her grandmother had been hiding something behind that mirror for at least 40 years. The second thing she understood was that whatever it was, Eleanor had believed it was dangerous, or important, or both. The third thing she understood was that her grandmother had specifically left the house to Sarah and not to anyone else, because she believed Sarah was the only one in the family who could be trusted with whatever lay behind the mirror. Sarah read the final entry 3 times. It was dated only weeks before Eleanor was moved into hospice. It read, in a hand that trembled visibly across the page, "If you are reading this, my dear, then you have found what I left for you. I am sorry to put this burden on you, but you were the one I trusted most. The mirror must come down. What is behind it is yours now. Be brave, be careful, and whatever you do, do not tell the rest of the family until you understand what you are looking at. They will not see it the way you do. Trust your own heart, Sarah. I love you. Grandma Eleanor." Sarah sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she finished reading. The grandfather clock in the sitting room chimed 11, then midnight, then 1 in the morning. She made another cup of coffee. She drank it slowly. She thought about her grandmother, the quiet woman who had always seemed slightly distant at family gatherings, the one who had sent Sarah birthday cards with $5 bills tucked inside until Sarah was 25. She thought about how Eleanor had been at her wedding, and how she had been at the hospital when Marcus was born, and how she had pressed a small wrapped package into Sarah's hands and said, "For when you need it." Sarah had never opened that package. She had put it in a drawer and forgotten about it, and somewhere in one of the moves it had been lost. She wondered now what had been inside. She wondered if everything had been a clue she had been too tired and too distracted to notice. She wondered how many other things her grandmother had been trying to tell her, gently, patiently, in the small ways the older woman had been able. Sarah finally went to bed at 2 in the morning. She did not sleep. She lay in the small bedroom across the hall from her grandmother's room and listened to the house settle around her, to the wind in the maple tree, to the distant hoot of an owl somewhere out in the woods, and she made a decision. She would take down the mirror. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. She needed time to think. She needed to be sure. But she would take it down. Her grandmother had left her a job to do, and Sarah Whitaker was not the kind of woman who walked away from a job, no matter how strange or frightening it turned out to be. The next morning, she woke up to Lily climbing into bed with her, smelling like the strawberry shampoo Sarah had bought from the dollar store. Lily wanted to know if they could have pancakes for breakfast. Sarah said yes. She made pancakes. She poured juice. She braided Emma's hair and helped Marcus find his missing sneaker. She drove them to school. She went to work at the diner. She came home. She mopped the kitchen floor. She did all the ordinary things that made up an ordinary life. And underneath all of it, the journal in her pocket and the mirror upstairs hummed at her like a low note she couldn't stop hearing. She didn't tell anyone. Not Marisol, who called twice that week to check in. Not Patty at the diner. Not the kids, especially not the kids. She wanted to understand what she was dealing with before she pulled anyone else into it. She read the journal 3 more times that week. She tried to look up some of the names her grandmother had mentioned, But the internet in Briarcliff was slow and patchy, and the names were too common to narrow down. She studied the sketches in the margins. She measured the mirror, using a tape measure she found in the basement, and she compared its size to the wall behind it. The mirror was 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide. The wall behind it, judging by the bedroom dimensions and the hallway on the other side, should have been a normal interior wall. There should have been nothing behind it but plaster and lath. But Sarah had a feeling, the kind of feeling that climbed up her spine and settled at the back of her neck, that there was more. By Friday night, she had made up her mind. She put the kids to bed early. She kissed each of them on the forehead. She told Marcus he was the best big brother in the world, which made him roll his eyes and pretend to be embarrassed. She poured herself a glass of water. She walked up the stairs to her grandmother's bedroom. She stood in front of the mirror, and she looked at her own reflection for a long moment. She thought about the woman she had been when she pulled into the driveway 6 weeks ago, scared and tired and barely holding on. She thought about the woman she was now, still scared, still tired, but standing in a house that was hers, doing something her grandmother had asked her to do. She took a breath. She lifted the mirror off the wall. It was heavier than she had expected, and she nearly dropped it, but she caught it against her hip and lowered it carefully to the floor, leaning it against the side of the vanity. She straightened up. She looked at the wall where the mirror had been, and what she saw made her step back, made her hand go to her mouth, made her knees go soft underneath her. Because the wall was not a wall. The wall was a door. Sarah stood there for what felt like a long time, just breathing. The door was set flush into the wall, painted over so many times that the seams had nearly disappeared. But now that she was looking at it, now that she knew what she was seeing, it was unmistakable. A rectangular frame, just slightly taller than she was, with hinges on the left side that had been disguised under layers of cream-colored paint. A handle that had been removed long ago, leaving only a small round dimple where it had once been. A keyhole near the center, painted shut, that no key had touched in decades. Her grandmother had hidden a door behind that mirror. Her grandmother had hung a 40-pound mirror over a door and lived with it like that for 40 years. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the wood. It was cool to the touch, and beneath her hand she could feel the faint give that wood has when it isn't backed by solid wall. Whatever was on the other side of this door wasn't another room of the house she had already explored. It was something else. She thought about going downstairs and getting a screwdriver. She thought about waiting until morning. She thought about calling Marisol, who was 4 hours away and probably already asleep with her own kids tucked in around her. She did none of those things. She sat down on the floor in front of the door instead and pulled the journal back out of her pocket and read the final entry one more time, slowly, the way her grandmother might have read it to her if she had still been alive. Be brave. Be careful. Trust your own heart. Sarah folded the journal, closed and held it against her chest. The clock downstairs chimed 10. She got up. She walked down to the basement, the one she had been avoiding because of the cobwebs, and because the kids had decided it was haunted. She pulled the chain on the bare bulb at the top of the stairs and went down step by step. The basement smelled like damp stone and old metal. Along the far wall, her grandfather's old workbench was still set up, the way he had left it before he died in the year Sarah was born. Tools hung from a pegboard, a coffee can full of nails, a jar of screws. Sarah picked through them until she found what she needed. A flathead screwdriver, a claw hammer, a flashlight that, by some small miracle, still had working batteries. She carried it all back upstairs. She set everything on the floor in front of the door. She knelt down. She took the flathead screwdriver and pressed its blade into the painted shut seam along the side of the door and started to chip away at the paint. It was slow work, and it was loud, and she had to keep stopping to listen for the kids. None of them stirred. The house was old, and the bedrooms were on the other side of the hallway, and the doors were thick. She worked her way down the seam, chipping and scraping, dust and flakes of paint falling onto the floor around her knees. 40 years of paint did not come away easily. She broke into a sweat. She had to switch hands twice to give her wrist a rest. But little by little, the seam came clear, a long, thin line of darkness against the cream-colored wall. She did the same on the other side, working from top to bottom, kneeling, then standing, then kneeling again. When she had cleared all 3 sides, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she had done. The door was now obvious, plain as a doorway in any other room. It just needed to be opened. She got up. She fitted the flathead screwdriver into the seam at the side, near where the handle should have been, and she pried. The door resisted. She pried harder. There was a soft cracking sound as the last of the paint gave way, and then, very slowly, the door swung an inch toward her. A breath of cold, stale air came out of the gap. Sarah froze. The air smelled like dust and cedar and something else, something faintly metallic, the way old coins smell when you hold a handful of them. She put down the screwdriver. She picked up the flashlight. She put her fingertips against the edge of the door and pulled it the rest of the way open. The flashlight beam swept into the dark beyond, and Sarah's brain refused, for several seconds, to process what she was looking at. The space behind the door was not a closet. It was not a hidden cubby or a small bricked-up alcove. It was a room. A proper room, maybe 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a slanted ceiling that followed the line of the roof above. A small round window high on the back wall, covered by a heavy curtain that had been tacked into place. A wooden floor, clean of dust in a way that the rest of the house was not, as if someone had cared for this room until very recently. Along the left wall, a tall wooden cabinet with glass doors, the kind you might see in a library. Along the right wall, a writing desk with a leather chair pushed in neatly. And on the desk, in the very center, a wooden box about the size of a small suitcase, bound in brass at the corners, with a heavy lock on the front. Sarah took one step into the room. The floorboards beneath her feet were solid, no creak, no give. The air was colder here than in the bedroom, the kind of cool that suggested the room was insulated, sealed off from the rest of the house, in some careful way she didn't yet understand. She swept the flashlight around. The cabinet on the left was full. She could see, even from where she stood, that the glass doors held shelves crowded with objects. Bundles of papers tied with string. Small boxes. What looked like leather-bound ledgers stacked on top of each other. A row of glass jars, the kind people used to use for canning, with their contents hidden behind labels in her grandmother's careful handwriting. There was a small lamp on the desk, with a brass base and a green glass shade, the kind of banker's lamp you'd see in an old library. Sarah reached for it on instinct, found a switch on the base, and clicked it. The lamp came on. She gasped out loud. There was electricity in this room. Her grandmother had wired this hidden room for power. The lamp threw a warm pool of green light across the desk and the box that sat on top of it. Sarah moved closer, almost afraid to. She put her hand on the box. The wood was smooth, polished, the kind of finish that takes decades to develop. The brass corners were tarnished, but solid. The lock on the front was old but in good shape, the kind of lock you could buy from a hardware store 80 years ago, and that nobody made anymore. She looked around for a key. She checked the desk drawers, 3 of them on the right side. The top drawer held pens and pencils, and a small bottle of ink that had dried up long ago. The middle drawer held envelopes and stationery with a monogrammed E in the corner. The bottom drawer held a single small velvet pouch, drawstring at the top. Sarah picked it up. Something heavy slid inside. She loosened the string. She turned the pouch upside down, and a single brass key fell into her palm, warm from the heat of her hand, even though it had been sitting in a cold drawer for 11 months or longer. She looked at the key. She looked at the box. She fit the key into the lock and turned it. The lock clicked open with the satisfying mechanical sound of something old and well-made finally being asked to do the job it was built for. Sarah lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was money. Bundles of cash, neatly banded with paper wrappers, stacked in 2 rows that took up the top of the box. $100 bills. She could see the faces through the wrappers. She had never in her life seen this much cash in one place. She put her hand against her own chest and felt her heart hammering. She counted, slowly, with her eyes only, because her fingers were shaking too much to count properly. There were 10 bundles. Each bundle had a paper band that read, in faded ink, $10,000. $100,000 in cash, sitting in the top of a wooden box in a hidden room behind a mirror in her grandmother's bedroom. Sarah sat down in the leather chair. The chair sighed under her weight, the leather soft and familiar, as if it had been waiting for her. She put her elbows on the desk. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She didn't laugh either. She just sat there, breathing, while the green light from the banker's lamp threw its soft glow across $100,000 that her grandmother had left for her in cash. After a long minute, she lifted the lid further because the box was deep and there was clearly more underneath. She lifted out the bundles of cash one by one and set them on the desk. Underneath the cash was a layer of velvet, dark blue, that covered something flat and rectangular. Sarah lifted the velvet, and then she made a sound, a small sound that she didn't recognize as her own voice, and she had to grip the edge of the desk because her vision swam. Underneath the velvet was a second layer of the box, and in that layer, set into individual cushioned compartments, were jewels. Not costume jewelry. Not the kind of pearls and gold chains that elderly women collected over a lifetime of birthdays and anniversaries. These were the kind of stones Sarah had only ever seen in museums and in the windows of high-end jewelers in the city, the kind you walked past with your hands in your pockets because you knew you weren't allowed inside. There was a necklace with a green stone the size of a quarter, surrounded by smaller white stones that threw back the green of the lamp with their own answering sparks. There was a ring with a clear stone so large that Sarah's first thought, stupidly, was that it had to be fake, because nothing real could be that big. There were a pair of earrings shaped like teardrops, with stones that shifted from blue to violet, depending on how she turned them. There was a brooch in the shape of a flower, with a yellow stone at the center, set in a metal that was clearly gold and clearly old, the kind of fine, hand-worked gold that machines couldn't reproduce. Sarah counted 12 pieces in the compartments. 12 pieces of jewelry. She had no idea what any of them were worth, but she knew, the way you know certain things in your bones, that the cash she had just set on the desk was the smallest part of what was in this box. She put her hands flat on the desk and made herself breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way her therapist had taught her 2 years ago, before she had to stop going because she couldn't afford it anymore. She thought about the kids sleeping down the hall. She thought about Marcus, who had been wearing the same winter coat for 2 years because he kept growing out of them faster than she could replace them. She thought about Emma, who had asked for piano lessons last summer and had cried, quietly so Sarah wouldn't see, when Sarah had told her they couldn't afford it right now. She thought about Lily, who had never had a new toy, only the hand-me-downs from her older siblings and the second-hand stuffed animals that Marisol's daughter had outgrown. And she thought about herself, the woman she had been a year ago, crying in the bathroom of her second job because a customer had thrown coffee at her. Sarah Whitaker put her head down on the desk, and she cried for 15 minutes, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it was in you. She cried for her grandmother, who had carried this secret alone for 40 years. She cried for the years she had spent counting pennies and feeling like a failure. She cried for what her kids' lives were about to become, because she didn't know yet how it would look, but she knew now that they would have a chance. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and then she sat up, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and kept going. There was more to the box. Underneath the jewelry compartments, in the bottom layer, was a stack of papers. Sarah lifted the cushioned tray out carefully and set it on the desk next to the cash. The papers underneath were yellow with age. The top one was a certificate of some kind, with an ornate border and a gold seal. Sarah picked it up. She held it under the lamp. It was a stock certificate, dated 1962, for 1,000 shares of a company she didn't recognize. The second paper was another certificate for a different company. The third was a bond, payable to her grandfather, issued in 1957. Sarah counted through the stack. 43 certificates and bonds in total. She had no idea what most of them were worth. She knew that some of them, the ones from companies whose names she did recognize, would be worth quite a lot, because the dates were old and the share counts were high. She set the certificates back into the box, gently, the way you would handle a sleeping baby. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Sarah closed the box. She locked it. She put the key in the pouch, and the pouch back in the bottom drawer, and she pushed the drawer closed. She stood up. Her legs were unsteady, the way they had been the first time she had stood up after giving birth, that strange weightless feeling of being too light for the ground. She looked around the hidden room again, with new eyes this time, because she understood now what kind of place it was. This was not just a hiding place for valuables. This was a working room. Her grandmother had spent time in here. There was a chair that had been sat in, a lamp that had been turned on and off, a desk that had been used, and along the far wall, on shelves she had only glanced at before, were her grandmother's records. Sarah crossed the room. She opened one of the glass cabinet doors. She pulled out one of the leather ledgers. She opened it to the first page. It was an inventory, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, dated 1981. A list of items, with descriptions, with appraised values, with notations on where each item had come from. Sarah scanned down the page. A necklace, a pair of earrings, a series of bond certificates, a small collection of coins. Each one was logged. Each one had a story. She turned to the next ledger. This one was older, the leather more worn. It went back to 1958. And the entries here were not just an inventory. They were a record of what her grandfather had brought home from his work overseas, item by item, year by year, before his death. Sarah sat down on the floor in front of the cabinet and started reading. Her grandfather had been an engineer, that much she had known. She had been told he worked overseas in his younger years, that he had traveled, that he had done well for himself. But the family had always been quietly modest. They had lived in this house, yes, and the house was beautiful, but they had never seemed to have the kind of money that the contents of that box suggested. Her grandfather and grandmother had driven the same car for 15 years. They had taken their vacations to the same lake in Vermont every summer. They had not bought new clothes often. They had not joined country clubs or thrown parties or done any of the things that wealthy people did to show off what they had. And now Sarah understood why. Her grandparents had been wealthy, very wealthy, and they had chosen, for reasons that were starting to become clear as Sarah read through the ledger, to hide it. Her grandfather had worked as an engineer for a mining and metals company based out of South Africa in the late 1940s and early 1950s. He had been assigned, according to her grandmother's notes, to projects in countries that were politically unstable, where his work had been valued and his discretion had been compensated handsomely. He had been paid not just in salary, but in stones, in metals, in shares of small companies that had eventually grown into very large companies. He had come home to America in 1956 with a wife he had met overseas, with a baby on the way, with several trunks of belongings, and with a private agreement to keep quiet about how much he had actually accumulated. There had been reasons. Sarah read on, and the reasons started to come clear. Her grandfather had not been a criminal, but he had worked in industries where the lines between legal and not quite legal had been blurry in ways that he didn't want to invite scrutiny over. He had been paid by people who didn't want the payments tracked. He had received gifts from grateful clients, the kind of gifts that came with the unspoken expectation that you wouldn't deposit them in a bank or write about them on your taxes. And so he had brought it all home, locked it in a wooden box, hidden the box behind a wall, and lived a small, quiet life with his wife and his only daughter in a small, quiet town in New England. When her grandfather died, Eleanor had inherited it all, and she had continued his approach. She had not sold anything. She had not deposited anything in a bank. She had kept it locked behind a mirror and lived modestly on her widow's pension and her late husband's savings. And she had been waiting, Sarah realized as she read through the ledgers, for the right time and the right person to pass it all on to. Sarah read every entry. There were notes from her grandmother about who in the family she had considered and rejected. The notes were not unkind, but they were honest. Her own daughter, Sarah's mother, had been too quick to spend, too easily impressed, too tangled up with a husband who Eleanor had never trusted. Sarah's Aunt Vivian was already wealthy in her own right and didn't need it. Sarah's cousins were either too young to be considered or had not, in Eleanor's careful judgment, shown the kind of character that this kind of inheritance required. And then there was Sarah. Sarah, who had been quiet and watchful as a child, who had visited Eleanor every summer for 2 weeks until Sarah was 16, who had sat with her grandmother on the porch swing and asked questions about Eleanor's life and listened to the answers. Sarah, who had grown up to marry the wrong man, who had been left with 3 children and no money and no support, and who had kept going anyway, working 2 jobs, raising her kids, never complaining where Eleanor could hear, never asking for help. Sarah, who Eleanor had been watching from a distance for the past 4 years, taking notes, making her decision, drawing up her will. There was an entry in the most recent ledger, dated only weeks before Eleanor had been moved to hospice, that read simply, "Sarah. She is the one. She will know what to do." Sarah closed the ledger. She held it against her chest. The room was warm now, the air heated by her own body, the lamp throwing its green glow, the silence of the house pressing in around her. She thought about her grandmother sitting in this same chair, writing those words. She thought about the years of watching, the years of waiting, the years of carrying this enormous secret alone, hoping that the right person would come along. She thought about the moment Eleanor had finally been sure. The moment she had picked up her pen and written, "Sarah. She is the one." Sarah said her grandmother's name out loud, into the empty room. She said, "Thank you." She didn't know if her grandmother could hear her. She didn't know if anything came after the life you lived. But she said it anyway, because it needed to be said. She stayed in the hidden room until almost 3 in the morning. She read every ledger. She cataloged, in her own head at least, what was in the cabinet. The glass jars on the upper shelf held coins, gold coins mostly, that her grandfather had collected over the years. There were small boxes containing more jewelry, less impressive than the pieces in the wooden box, but still valuable. There were papers documenting the chain of ownership of various items. Her grandfather's careful work to make sure that if anyone ever asked, he could prove that he had come by these things legitimately, even if he had never reported them. There were photographs, faded, of her grandfather standing in front of mines and factories in countries with palm trees and red dirt. There were letters, in languages Sarah couldn't read, that her grandmother had translated in pencil in the margins. The room was, Sarah realized, more than just a hiding place. It was an archive. It was the documentation of a quiet, private fortune that had been built over a single lifetime and then carefully, deliberately, kept out of sight for the better part of 70 years. When Sarah finally went to bed that night, she did not sleep. She lay on her back in the small bedroom across the hall, and she watched the ceiling and she thought about what she was going to do. The $100,000 in cash was, by itself, more money than she had ever had at one time in her entire life. The jewelry, if she could find someone trustworthy to appraise it, could be worth 10 times that, maybe more. The stock certificates and bonds, depending on which companies were still around, could be worth anything from nothing to a small fortune. The gold coins, even at the most basic level, were worth a substantial amount. Add it all up, and Sarah was sitting on a hidden inheritance that could change not just her life, but her children's lives, and probably their children's lives after them. And nobody in the family knew. Nobody. Not her mother, who had been calling Sarah every other week for the past 2 months trying to figure out why Eleanor had left the house to Sarah specifically. Not her Aunt Vivian, who had sent a passive-aggressive birthday card last month with a note implying that Sarah was somehow taking advantage of a confused old woman. Not her cousins, who had been making jokes at the funeral about how Sarah had probably bullied Grandma Eleanor into changing her will. None of them knew. None of them would know, Sarah decided, until she had figured out what she was doing. She fell asleep around 5 in the morning. She slept for 2 hours. She got up at 7, when Lily came padding into her bedroom, asking for breakfast. She made oatmeal. She braided Emma's hair. She found Marcus's missing shoe under the dining room table, where Lily had hidden it for reasons known only to Lily. She drove the kids to school. She came home. She went up to her grandmother's bedroom. She stood in front of the open hidden door, and she made a list, on a piece of paper, of everything she needed to do. First, she needed to put the mirror back. Not because she wanted to hide the room from her own family, but because she didn't want curious eyes seeing it from the hallway when the kids ran past. Second, she needed to find someone to appraise the jewelry. Not anyone in Briarcliff, because Briarcliff was small and word would travel. Someone in the city, someone reputable, someone who specialized in estate jewelry and would understand the importance of discretion. Third, she needed to figure out the stock certificates and bonds, which meant finding a financial advisor she could trust, which meant doing research, which meant being careful. Fourth, she needed to think very, very carefully about her family. That last item was the hardest. Sarah loved her mother, in the complicated way that adult children love parents who have disappointed them. Her mother, Margaret, had been a difficult woman all of Sarah's life. Quick to anger, quicker to spend, always chasing the next get-rich-quick idea, always borrowing money from people and forgetting to pay it back. Sarah's father had finally left when Sarah was 19, exhausted by Margaret's spending and her drinking, and Margaret had spent the years since blaming everyone but herself. She had blamed Sarah, in particular, for not being more supportive. She had blamed Eleanor for not being a more generous mother. She had blamed Sarah's father for being a coward. She had never, in Sarah's hearing, blamed herself. If Margaret knew about the contents of the hidden room, Sarah understood with a clarity that hurt. Margaret would not be able to keep the secret. Margaret would tell Aunt Vivian within a week. Margaret would tell her drinking buddies within a month. Margaret would try to claim some of it for herself, would argue that as Eleanor's daughter she had more right to it than Sarah did, would hire a lawyer or threaten to hire a lawyer, would make Sarah's life a misery for the next several years if she found out. And then there was Aunt Vivian. Vivian was wealthy, yes, but Vivian was also greedy. Vivian had married a man who owned car dealerships, and Vivian had spent the past 3 decades collecting expensive things and looking down on people who couldn't. Vivian would not need the money, but Vivian would want it, the way some people always want what other people have, especially when that other person is someone they consider beneath them. Sarah understood, sitting at her grandmother's vanity table with the mirror leaning against the wall behind her, that her grandmother had not just left her a fortune. Her grandmother had left her a test of character, a test of judgment. Could Sarah handle this without it twisting her into something she didn't want to be? Could she keep it quiet until she was ready? Could she resist the pull of telling her mother, of trying to make peace through a windfall, of buying her way out of the lifetime of conflict she had with the older woman? Could she protect her children from the kind of vultures who would descend on their family the moment word got out? Sarah looked at herself in her grandmother's vanity mirror, the small one above the dresser, not the big one that had hidden the door. She looked tired. She looked older than her 29 years. But she also looked, she thought, like someone who could do this. Like someone whose grandmother had been right to trust her. She got up. She rehung the big mirror, with some difficulty, because it really was very heavy, and the door behind it disappeared once again into the wall. She closed the bedroom door. She went downstairs and made herself a sandwich, and she started to plan. The first thing she did was she called in sick to the diner for the next 2 days. Patty was annoyed but understanding. Sarah had not missed a single shift in the 2 months she had been working there. The second thing she did was she drove an hour and a half south to a town big enough to have a bank that wasn't connected to anyone she knew. She opened a safety deposit box at a branch where the staff didn't recognize her face. She rented the biggest box they had. She drove home. She took out all of the loose jewelry from the hidden cabinet, the pieces that weren't in the wooden box, the ones that had been on the upper shelves. She put them in a small canvas bag. She drove back to the bank. She placed the canvas bag in the safety deposit box. She drove home. She slept that night the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who has crossed a line and can't go back, but at least is making progress in the right direction. The next day, she did the same with the gold coins. The day after that, she did the same with the most valuable of the bond certificates, the ones from companies she had researched and discovered were still in operation, still publicly traded, and probably worth substantial amounts. By the end of the week, the hidden room behind the mirror had been emptied of most of its contents, and a single safety deposit box in a town an hour and a half south was holding what was probably several $1 million worth of inheritance. Sarah kept the cash. The $100,000 stayed at the house, hidden in a new spot she had picked herself, because she needed access to it. She had bills that were past due. She had a car that needed work. She had children whose winter coats were too small and whose shoes were falling apart. She didn't want to spend the money carelessly, but she also wasn't going to keep struggling when her grandmother had clearly meant for that struggle to end. She took one of the bundles of cash, $10,000, and she paid off her overdue bills. She caught up on every account that had been calling and threatening her for the past year. She paid down the credit cards. She fixed the car. She bought the kids new coats, new shoes, new backpacks, and she took them out to a real restaurant for the first time in their lives. The kind of place with cloth napkins and waiters who brought you bread before your meal. The kids did not understand. They asked her where the money had come from. She told them that her grandmother had left her some savings, and that they were going to be okay now, and that they should enjoy their dinner. Marcus, who was old enough to know better than to ask too many questions, gave her a long look across the table. He didn't push, but Sarah could see, in the way he carefully cut his chicken, that he understood something had changed. She would tell him more, eventually. She would tell all of them more, when they were old enough. But for now, she wanted them to just be kids enjoying a nice dinner, without the weight of the family secret on their small shoulders. The hardest part of the next few weeks was keeping quiet. Sarah's mother called twice a week, fishing for information about the house, asking pointed questions about whether Sarah had found anything interesting in Eleanor's things, suggesting that maybe Sarah should bring some of the antiques down so the family could decide together what to do with them. Sarah was polite but vague. She said the house was full of old furniture, mostly, and that she was still going through everything, and that she would let the family know if she found anything of significance. She did not technically lie. She just didn't volunteer the truth. Her mother, Sarah could tell, was suspicious. Margaret had always had a sixth sense for money, the way some people have a sixth sense for incoming weather. She could smell a windfall from a county away, and she was sniffing now, and Sarah could feel her getting closer. Aunt Vivian called once, with a syrupy voice, to see how Sarah was settling in. Vivian asked if Sarah had thought about selling the house, because Vivian's husband knew someone who would pay a good price for an old Victorian like that. Sarah said the will required her to keep the house for a year, and she changed the subject. Vivian, taking the hint, did not call again. But Sarah suspected she was talking to Margaret regularly, and the two of them together had always been a dangerous combination. The cousins were a different problem. Sarah had 3 cousins, all on her mother's side, and the oldest of them, a man named Robert who was about 10 years older than Sarah and had always been a particular kind of unpleasant, started showing up in Briarcliff. The first time was a surprise. Sarah came home from the diner one afternoon and found Robert sitting in his black truck in her driveway, drinking a coffee he had clearly bought from Patty's. He got out, all smiles, and said he had been in the area on business and wanted to stop in and see how Sarah was doing. Sarah, who had not known Robert had any business north of Boston, played dumb. She invited him in for a coffee because not inviting him in would have been suspicious. She gave him a tour of the parts of the house she didn't mind him seeing. She did not take him upstairs. He asked questions about the property, about the land, about how much she thought the house was worth. He asked if she had found any of Eleanor's old jewelry, because his wife had always admired some pieces and would be interested in buying them from Sarah if Sarah wasn't planning to keep them. Sarah said she hadn't found anything like that yet. Robert smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and he left a little while later, and Sarah locked the door behind him and stood in the entryway for a long time with her heart beating too fast. He came back a week later, and then the week after that, and then he started bringing his wife, a woman named Tina who was sweet to Sarah's face and who Sarah did not trust an inch. They asked to look around. They commented on how much work the house needed. They suggested, on their third visit, that maybe Sarah should consider letting one of them stay there for a while to help her get the place in shape. Sarah refused, as politely as she could. Robert's face tightened. Tina put her hand on Sarah's arm and said that Robert was just trying to help. That family had to look out for family. Sarah said she appreciated the offer, but that she and the kids were managing fine. She showed them out. She closed the door. She leaned against the wall in the hallway and she started to shake, because she understood now that Robert knew something, or suspected something, or had been told something by Sarah's mother. Whatever it was, Robert was circling, and Sarah was going to have to figure out how to deal with him before it became a real problem. She talked to a lawyer the next day. She drove the hour and a half south to the same town where her safety deposit box was, and she walked into a small law firm in a brick building on the main street, and she sat down across from a woman named Elaine Foster, who specialized in estate and inheritance law. Sarah told her the whole story. Not everything, not the exact contents of the hidden room, but enough. She told Elaine that she had inherited a house from her grandmother. She told her there were assets in the house that she was still cataloging. She told her that her family was starting to take an unhealthy interest in those assets, and that she wanted to make sure her position was protected. Elaine listened with the kind of patient attention that Sarah had not experienced in a professional setting in a very long time. When Sarah was done talking, Elaine asked her a series of careful questions. About the will. About whether Sarah had received the original signed copy, which she had. about whether there had been any witnesses to the signing, which there had been, the notary Mr. Pemberton and one of his colleagues, about whether anyone in the family had legally contested the will yet, which they had not. Elaine nodded. She said that Sarah's position was strong, that the will was airtight, that the property and its contents belonged to Sarah and Sarah alone. She said that Sarah was under no obligation to share any of it with anyone else in the family, regardless of what they thought they were entitled to. She said that if anyone tried to pressure Sarah, or worse, threaten her, Sarah should call her immediately. She gave Sarah her direct cell phone number. She gave Sarah a card with the firm's address. Sarah cried in her car for 10 minutes after the appointment. Not from sadness this time, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of having someone in her corner, of having a professional, paid by her, with no conflict of interest, who had told her in plain language that what she had was hers, that she was allowed to have it, that she was allowed to keep it. Sarah drove back to Briarcliff with Elaine's card in her wallet and a new kind of steadiness in her chest. When Robert came back the following Saturday, this time with both Tina and Sarah's mother in tow, Sarah was ready. She did not invite them in. She stood on the porch in her coat, and she told them politely that she was busy and that she wasn't taking visitors that day. Her mother's face went red. Robert's face went still in that dangerous way men's faces sometimes went still. Tina opened her mouth to say something honeyed. Sarah cut her off. She said she had a lawyer now, and that any further visits should go through the lawyer, and that if anyone showed up at her door uninvited again, she would be calling the police. She said this calmly, evenly, without raising her voice, and she watched the realization roll over their faces one after the other. Her mother started to cry. Robert started to bluster. Tina just stared. Sarah said goodbye. She went inside. She closed the door. She locked it. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor of the entryway, and she breathed, in and out, until the shaking in her hands stopped. Marcus found her there a few minutes later, sent by Lily to ask if they could have a snack. He looked at his mother sitting on the floor. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat down next to her, 8 years old, in his two small sneakers, and he leaned his head against her shoulder, and Sarah put her arm around him and held him close, and she thought, this is why. This is why I'm doing all of this. This is why I'm keeping the secret, why I'm being careful, why I'm not letting my family steal what my grandmother left me. Because of him. Because of his sisters. Because they deserve a mother who can give them the life they should have had all along. The family did not come back to the house that month. Or the next. Robert called twice, leaving angry voicemails, which Sarah forwarded to Elaine. Margaret called weekly, alternating between begging and accusing, sometimes in the same message. Sarah did not return her calls. It hurt. It hurt more than Sarah wanted to admit. There is a particular kind of pain in cutting off your own mother, even a mother who has hurt you for decades, and Sarah cried about it sometimes at night, after the kids were asleep. But she did not call back. She had made her choice. She was going to protect what her grandmother had given her, and that included protecting her kids from the kind of people who would tear it all apart for a quick payday. In the meantime, she was doing what she had set out to do. She found a jeweler in Boston, an older man named Mr. Lerner who had been recommended by Elaine, and she made an appointment to bring in a few of the smaller pieces from the wooden box for appraisal. She did not bring everything at once. She brought 3 pieces. Mr. Lerner looked at them under his loupe for almost an hour, asking her quiet questions about provenance, about her grandfather, about the chain of ownership. Sarah was honest with him. She did not pretend to know more than she did. She showed him the entries in her grandmother's ledgers that corresponded to those 3 pieces, and Mr. Lerner read them with the kind of attention that meant he was taking them seriously. When he was finished, he set the loupe down. He folded his hands on the desk. He told Sarah that the 3 pieces she had brought in were worth, conservatively, between $400,000 and $600,000. The necklace with the green stone alone, an emerald of exceptional quality and clarity in a setting that Mr. Lerner identified as French, late 19th century, was worth at least $300,000 by itself. Sarah did not faint. She had thought she might, but she didn't. She just sat there in his office, with the 3 pieces of jewelry in a velvet tray between them, and she heard her grandmother's voice in the back of her head, saying, Sarah, she is the one. She will know what to do. And Sarah, for the first time, thought she might actually know what to do. She thought she might be ready to find out. Sarah walked out of Mr. Lerner's office that afternoon with the 3 pieces of jewelry tucked back into the canvas bag she had brought them in, and she sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time before she felt steady enough to drive. For to $600,000. For 3 pieces. 3 out of 12, just in the wooden box, and that didn't count the loose jewelry in the cabinet, the gold coins, the bonds, the certificates, or any of the rest of it. Sarah did the math in her head as she finally pulled out of the parking garage and merged onto the highway heading north. If 3 pieces were worth that much, and the other 9 were of comparable quality, then the jewelry alone could be worth somewhere between $1.5 and $2 million. Just the jewelry. And she was almost certainly being conservative. She had brought him 3 of the pieces that looked less impressive to her untrained eye, on purpose, because she had wanted to feel out his honesty before showing him the truly stunning items. Mr. Lerner, to his credit, had not tried to lowball her. He had given her what felt like a fair number, with notes on how to get even higher offers from auction houses if she was willing to be patient. Sarah was willing to be patient. Sarah had been patient her whole life. Patient could be her middle name. She drove home with the radio off and the window cracked, the cold New England wind cutting across her face, and she thought about her grandmother. She thought about what kind of woman it took to sit on this kind of wealth for 40 years and not touch it, not flaunt it, not let it change her. Eleanor had worn a single string of pearls to Sarah's wedding. She had given each of her grandchildren modest birthday gifts, $50 in a card, the same amount every year, into adulthood. She had driven a Buick from the early 90s until the day she stopped driving. She had clipped coupons. She had sewn her own curtains. She had lived, in every observable way, like a woman of modest means, and she had carried a fortune behind a mirror in her bedroom the entire time. Sarah wondered if Eleanor had ever been tempted to spend it, if she had ever sat at that desk in the hidden room and pulled out a stack of cash and thought, just this once. If she had ever stood in front of the wooden box and wondered if her husband would forgive her for selling one of the pieces, just to take a real vacation, just to buy a real car, just to be the kind of woman who got her hair done at a salon instead of at her kitchen table with a pair of scissors and a hand mirror. Sarah suspected that she had been tempted many times over many years. And she had said no, every time, because she had been waiting. She had been waiting for the right person to leave it to. Sarah understood now, in a way she had not understood before, that her grandmother had spent her entire adult life as a kind of guardian, a keeper of something that wasn't really hers to keep, that wasn't really hers to spend, that had been entrusted to her by her husband and that she had honored, in turn, by waiting for the right hands to place it into. Sarah was those hands, and she was going to honor that trust in her own way. The next few months were the strangest of Sarah's life. On the outside, almost nothing changed. She continued to wait tables at Patty's Diner 3 days a week. She continued to drive her old Honda, even though she could now afford to replace it, because she didn't want to draw attention to herself in a town as small as Briarcliff. She continued to wear her same clothes, to clip coupons at the grocery store, to make the kids' meals from inexpensive ingredients. She did not buy new furniture. She did not redecorate the house. She did not, in any visible way, suggest to anyone in Briarcliff that anything had changed in her circumstances. On the inside, though, everything had changed. She had met 3 more times with Mr. Lerner, bringing in pieces by 2s and 3s. She had brought in the gold coins to a different appraiser, recommended by Elaine, and had received an estimate that had made her sit down hard on a folding chair in the man's office. She had taken the bond certificates and the stock certificates to a financial planner in Boston, a woman named Teresa who had been recommended by Mr. Lerner, and Teresa had spent 2 weeks researching everything and had come back with a number that Sarah had asked her to repeat 3 times because she could not quite believe she had heard it correctly. The total value of what was in that hidden room, including the cash, the jewelry, the coins, the bonds, the certificates, and a small collection of rare books that Sarah had nearly overlooked, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.4 million. $8.4 million. Sarah was a multimillionaire. Sarah, who had been crying over a $30 overdraft fee less than a year ago, was now the kind of person who got referred to as a high-net-worth individual in the cautious, polite language that financial planners used. She did not buy anything. Not at first. She set the money up in accounts, with Teresa's help. She put the bulk of it into investments that would grow slowly and steadily. The kind of conservative portfolio that a woman with 3 children and no other safety net should have. She put a chunk of it into a college fund for each of the kids, fully funded, so that wherever any of them wanted to go to school, the money would be there. She put another chunk into a trust for the kids, with terms that meant they would have access to it gradually as they grew older, so that no one of them could blow through it in their 20s on bad ideas. She kept enough in liquid savings to make her feel safe, the way she had not felt safe in a decade. She did not buy a new car. She did not buy new clothes. She did not move out of the Victorian. She did, eventually, hire a contractor to fix the things that needed fixing in the house. The roof, the heating system, the cracked window in the kitchen, the leak in the upstairs bathroom. She did it slowly, room by room, and she did it with local workers, men she knew from the diner, men whose work she had heard praised at the counter, men who were grateful for the steady pay and who did not ask questions about where the money was coming from. The house began to come alive under their hands. The peeling paint was scraped and the boards underneath were repainted in the same faded blue that had been there before, only fresh this time. The sagging porch swing was replaced. The bushes around the foundation were cut back so the front of the house could breathe. The garden in the back was tilled and amended and prepared for spring planting. By the time the snow started falling that December, the blue Victorian on the edge of Briarcliff looked like a house that someone loved. Inside, things changed too, but slowly. Sarah bought the kids the things they had been needing for years. New mattresses, new winter coats, this time the good ones, the kind that would last more than a single season. A piano for Emma, which she found used through a classified ad and had delivered one Saturday morning while Emma was at Theo's house, so that when Emma came home, the piano was sitting in the corner of the sitting room as if it had always been there. Emma had cried. She had touched the keys with her fingertips like they were made of glass. She had asked Sarah if she could really play it, and Sarah had told her of course, and that they would find a teacher in town for her, which they did the following week. The teacher was a retired music professor who had moved to Briarcliff in his 60s, a kind man named Mr. Holmgren, who came to the house every Tuesday afternoon and sat next to Emma at the piano and taught her with the patience of a man who had nothing left to prove. Marcus got his own room. Finally, the one with the window seat overlooking the maple tree, and Sarah filled it with the bookshelves and the desk and the reading lamp she had been wanting to give him since he was old enough to read. He read every night, sprawled on the window seat, working through the children's section of the Briarcliff Public Library at a rate that surprised even Sarah, who had always known he was smart, but had not known how voracious he could be once he had a quiet place to sit. Lily got a real bedroom, decorated in the pale yellow she had asked for, with a real bed and real shelves for her stuffed animals, which she lined up every night in a precise order that only she understood. She slept through the night, every night, for the first time in her life. The kids did not know about the money, not the real amount. They knew that Grandma Eleanor had left them some savings, and that they were doing better now, and that Sarah didn't have to work as many hours at the diner as she used to. Marcus, who was the oldest and the most observant, asked more questions than the others. He noticed when the new appliances arrived. He noticed when the heating system stopped clanking. He noticed when Sarah stopped wearing the same 3 pairs of jeans on rotation. Sarah answered his questions as honestly as she could without giving him the full picture. She told him that Grandma Eleanor had been more careful with her money than the family had realized, and that she had left them enough to live comfortably, and that the most important thing was that they had each other, and they had a home, and they were safe. Marcus seemed to accept this. Sarah suspected he had figured out more than he was letting on, in the way that perceptive children always know more than the adults around them want to believe, but he was not the kind of kid to demand answers he could see his mother wasn't ready to give. He was, in many ways, a smaller version of Eleanor. Sarah saw it more and more as the months went by. The way he watched, the way he waited, the way he kept his own counsel. The family came back, of course. They did not stay away forever. Robert and Tina drove up one weekend in late January, when the roads were bad and Sarah had no reason to expect them, and they pulled into the driveway, just as Sarah was carrying groceries in from her car. Robert got out of his truck with the smile of a man who had decided that smiling was the strategy he was going to try this time. He said he had been thinking about Sarah, that he wanted to apologize for how things had gone the last time, that he hoped they could talk like family. Sarah set her grocery bags down on the porch. She looked at him for a long moment. She told him that she had nothing to apologize for, and that he was welcome to leave a message with her lawyer if he had something to say. Robert's smile slipped. Tina stepped forward and started talking, the way Tina did, all soft and concerned, about how the family was worried about Sarah, about how she was isolating herself, about how it wasn't healthy for the kids to be cut off from their grandmother and their cousins. Sarah listened. She did not interrupt. When Tina was done, Sarah said, very calmly, that her mother had spent Sarah's entire life damaging her, that her family had not once offered to help when Sarah was struggling, and that the only person in the family who had ever shown her real love had been Eleanor, and Eleanor was gone now. Sarah said she was not interested in pretending that family meant something to people who had not bothered to show up when it mattered. She said that if Robert and Tina wanted to come back for a real conversation, with her lawyer present, she was open to it. Otherwise, she said, they should leave. Tina opened her mouth. Sarah shook her head. Tina closed her mouth. They left. Sarah's mother tried a different approach a few weeks later. She showed up alone, in a rental car, looking thinner than Sarah remembered, with her hair freshly dyed and her makeup carefully applied. She knocked on the door at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, when the kids were at school and Sarah was home alone, drinking coffee in the kitchen. Sarah saw her through the window. For a long moment, Sarah considered not answering. Then she opened the door. Margaret stood on the porch in a coat that was too thin for the weather, holding a paper grocery bag in her arms. She had been crying. Sarah could see the tracks of the tears under the makeup. Margaret said she had come to apologize. She said she had been wrong about a lot of things for a long time. She said she didn't want Sarah to think she was here for money. She had brought a few of the things from her own kitchen, things she thought Sarah might like, because she remembered that Sarah had always liked her chicken soup, and she had brought a container of it, still warm. Sarah looked at her mother. She thought about all the times she had wanted exactly this moment, when she was younger. The apology, the acknowledgement, the mother coming to her child with chicken soup and tears and an admission of wrongdoing. She thought about how, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, she would have collapsed into her mother's arms and forgiven her on the spot. She thought about how she would have wanted, desperately, to believe that her mother had finally changed. Sarah did not collapse. She did not invite her mother in immediately. She stood in the doorway and she looked at Margaret for a long, hard minute, and she tried to see whether this was real. It might have been. Sarah would never know for sure. People are complicated, and even bad mothers can have moments of real regret, and Margaret had been through a hard life of her own, even if much of it had been of her own making. Sarah, in the end, opened the door wider and let her mother come in. She did not let her mother into the kitchen. She kept her in the sitting room, where the velvet sofa was, where the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. She poured her mother a cup of coffee. She listened. Margaret talked for almost 2 hours. She talked about her own mother, about the ways Eleanor had been distant and judgmental and impossible to please. She talked about Sarah's father, about the things he had done and the things she had done back. She talked about her drinking, which she said she had been working on, with a therapist. Sarah did not know if she believed any of it, but she let her mother talk. When Margaret was finally done, when she had wiped her eyes and finished her cold coffee, she looked at Sarah and asked, in a small voice, if there was any way they could try again, if there was any way they could be in each other's lives. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she said that she didn't know. She said that she was not going to make any promises today, that she needed to think about it, that she needed to see if her mother's actions matched her words over time. She said that the children were not part of the equation yet, that they would not meet their grandmother until Sarah was sure it was safe. She said she would call her mother in a month to check in, and that they would go from there. Margaret nodded. She said she understood. She got up. She left the chicken soup on the counter. She drove away. Sarah watched the rental car disappear down the driveway, and then she sat down on the velvet sofa, and she cried. For a long time, for all the years of mothering she had not received, and for the cautious, fragile hope that maybe, someday, she might still get some of it back. Aunt Vivian, when she eventually came, did not get the same reception. Vivian arrived in early March, in her husband's Mercedes, with a fur coat draped over her shoulders and a thin smile on her face. She did not call ahead. She did not bring soup. She rang the doorbell and stood on the porch with the posture of a woman who expected to be invited in immediately, and Sarah, who had seen the Mercedes coming up the driveway, met her on the porch instead. Vivian made small talk about the weather and about how the house was looking better than she remembered. She asked, with elaborate casualness, if she could come in for a tour, since she had not been inside since they had cleaned out Eleanor's things after the funeral. Sarah said no. Vivian's smile froze. Sarah said that the house was hers now, that it was her home, and that she was not in the business of giving tours to family members who had not bothered to show up for her for the previous decade. Vivian's face turned a particular shade of red that Sarah had seen on her mother many times and never on her aunt. Vivian said, in a voice that had abandoned all pretense of warmth, that she had a right to know what had been in her mother's house. She said that Eleanor had been her mother too, and that whatever had been left to Sarah had been left to her by someone who had been declining mentally for years, and that Vivian had been speaking with a lawyer about contesting the will. Sarah took a breath. She said that Vivian was welcome to do whatever she felt she needed to do, but that she should know two things. First, that the will was airtight, drafted by a notary while Eleanor had been of completely sound mind, witnessed by two qualified professionals who would testify to that fact. Second, that Sarah had her own lawyer, and that any contact going forward should go through her. Vivian's mouth opened. Sarah did not let her speak. Sarah said goodbye, calmly, and she stepped back inside, and she closed the door, and she locked it. Vivian stood on the porch for almost 5 minutes. Sarah watched her through the window. Eventually, Vivian got back in her Mercedes and drove away, and Sarah called Elaine, and Elaine took down the details, and that was the last time Vivian set foot on the property. Robert tried twice more. Both times, Sarah did not answer the door. He left notes, threatening at first, then pleading, then threatening again. Sarah saved them all. She gave them to Elaine. Elaine sent Robert a cease and desist letter on her firm's letterhead, and Robert stopped coming after that, though Sarah heard through her mother, in the careful, monthly phone calls they had started to have, that Robert had become bitter and was telling anyone in the family who would listen that Sarah had stolen Eleanor's estate. Sarah did not engage. She kept her head down. She raised her kids. She fixed her house. She showed up to her shifts at the diner, even though she didn't need the money anymore, because she had come to love the work and the people and the way Patty would slide her a fresh cup of coffee at exactly the moment Sarah needed it without having to ask. She did not tell Patty about the money. She told Patty that her grandmother had left her enough to be comfortable, and that she enjoyed the work, and that she didn't want to sit at home all day, and Patty had accepted this without question. Patty was the kind of woman who did not pry. Patty was the kind of woman who, Sarah suspected, had her own secrets she had earned the right not to explain. The first time Sarah did something that could not be hidden, that anyone in town might have noticed, was in April. The town's elementary school, the one Marcus and Emma attended, sent a letter home to all the families saying that the school was in danger of losing its music program due to budget cuts. There was a fundraising drive being organized, bake sales, a car wash, a raffle. The whole thing felt small and desperate, the way these things always did in small towns, and the letter ended with a plea for donations of any size. Sarah read it at the kitchen table. She thought about Emma sitting at the piano with Mr. Holmgren on Tuesday afternoons. She thought about the kids at the school who didn't have a piano at home, who didn't have a retired music professor giving them private lessons, who would lose the only access to music they were ever going to get if the program disappeared. She wrote a check the next morning. She wrote it for the full amount the program needed for the year, plus a little extra to cover the next year as a buffer. She drove it down to the school office. She handed it to the secretary in an envelope. She asked the secretary not to use her name, to mark it as an anonymous donation. The secretary, a woman named Mrs. Henley, whose face Sarah recognized from the diner, looked at the check and then looked at Sarah and then looked at the check again. Mrs. Henley did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said she would keep Sarah's request and that the school would be very grateful and that Sarah was a good woman. Sarah said thank you and left, and she drove home in the spring sunshine with the windows down, and she felt lighter than she had felt in a long time. The donation, of course, became local news. Not Sarah's name, because Mrs. Henley kept her word, but the fact of the donation. The local paper ran a small story about it on the front page of the community section. The principal wrote a letter to all the parents thanking the anonymous donor. The kids in the music program made a banner that hung in the front lobby of the school for a month. Sarah saw it when she went to pick Marcus up one afternoon, and she stood in front of it for a minute, looking at the colorful crayon letters and the names of all the kids who had signed it, and she thought about Eleanor. About the woman who had lived for 40 years with the kind of money that could change communities and had given $5 in a birthday card. Sarah did not blame her grandmother for that. She understood now that her grandmother had been keeping the money safe for a reason, and that the reason had been Sarah, and that Sarah was now free to do with it what Eleanor had not been able to do herself. Sarah suspected this had been part of what Eleanor had wanted. Not for Sarah to keep it all locked up the way Eleanor had been forced to. For Sarah to actually use it. To do good with it. To repair some of the small broken things in the world around her, in the careful, quiet, anonymous way that Eleanor had taught her by example for 30 years. After the school donation, Sarah found that she could not stop. She did not become reckless. She did not announce herself to the world. She just started looking around, paying attention, noticing the small needs that nobody else seemed willing to fix. The Briarcliff Fire Department was using equipment from the 80s. Sarah wrote a check, anonymously, for new gear. The town's library had been trying to raise money for a children's reading room. Sarah covered it. The food pantry that ran out of the basement of the Methodist church was operating on a budget so thin that they sometimes had to turn families away. Sarah set up a recurring monthly donation, large enough that the pantry's director cried when she got the first deposit notification and could not figure out for weeks where it had come from. Word spread, slowly, that someone in town was doing this kind of thing. There was speculation about who it might be. The local paper ran articles. The diner was full of theories. Patty, behind the counter, would listen to her regulars debate the question and pour their coffee and never say a word. Sarah, sitting at the back booth on her breaks, eating Patty's chicken pot pie, never said anything either. She would just listen and smile to herself and go back to her shift. The kids did not know. Sarah had decided not to tell them yet. She wanted them to learn from her actions, not from her descriptions of her actions. She wanted them to grow up watching their mother quietly take care of the people around her, without making a show of it, without expecting anything in return, and she wanted that to become the kind of life that seemed normal to them. The kind of life she wished her own family had taught her. In the meantime, the kids were thriving. Marcus's reading scores had jumped 2 grade levels in a single year, the kind of improvement that the teachers at his school had pulled Sarah aside to praise, and which Sarah had downplayed because she didn't want Marcus to feel any pressure he didn't need. Emma was playing pieces on the piano that Mr. Holmgren said were ahead of her age. She had a quiet, focused intensity at the keyboard that surprised even Sarah, who had not known her middle daughter had it in her. Emma would practice without being asked, sometimes for 2 hours at a stretch, until her fingers cramped and Sarah had to physically lift her hands off the keys and tell her it was bedtime. Lily, who was 4 when they moved in and was now 5, was happy in the simple, complete way that small children can be happy. She had friends at her preschool. She had her room with the yellow walls. She had her mother and her siblings around her at all hours. She did not remember much, anymore, about the apartment with the bad heater and the loud neighbors. She had absorbed the new life with the easy adaptability of a young child, and she would grow up, Sarah realized, with no real memory of how hard things had been. This was a gift Sarah had not anticipated. Marcus would remember. Emma would remember in fragments. But Lily would just have this. The Victorian. The maple tree. The piano in the corner. The mother who was home for breakfast every morning. Sarah cried about it sometimes, in the bathroom, where the kids couldn't see her, because the relief of being able to give her youngest a real childhood was something she could not have prepared herself for. She had not known how much she had been carrying, until she had been able to put it down. The family, after their various rebuffed attempts to claim a piece of Eleanor's estate, eventually quieted. Robert moved on to other grievances, the way men like Robert always do. Vivian filed paperwork with a lawyer that, after Elaine's firm responded with a carefully drafted reply outlining the strength of the will and the documentation behind it, was quietly dropped. Margaret kept calling. The conversations were short and careful and stilted, but they continued, month after month, and over the course of a year Sarah started to believe that her mother might really be trying. Margaret was sober, by all accounts. Margaret had a job at a craft store, which she had held for over a year. Margaret had started attending a church, which Sarah was suspicious of in some ways but grateful for in others, because it seemed to be giving her mother the structure she had never been able to find on her own. When the anniversary of Eleanor's death came, Margaret called Sarah and asked if she could come up to Briarcliff to visit the grave. Sarah, after a long pause, said yes. Margaret drove up. They went to the cemetery together. They stood in front of Eleanor's headstone, which Sarah had paid to have engraved with a longer inscription than the family had originally planned, a line from one of Eleanor's favorite books. Margaret cried. Sarah did not cry. Sarah just stood there, with her hands in her coat pockets, and she thought about her grandmother, and about her mother, and about the strange way that grief could sometimes do the work that years of nothing else had failed to do. Margaret asked, on the drive back, if she could meet the kids. Sarah said maybe, on a future visit, if Margaret kept doing what she was doing. Margaret nodded. She did not push. She drove home that night. The next time she came up, 3 months later, she met the kids for one afternoon, supervised, with Sarah present the entire time, and Margaret had been on her absolute best behavior, and the kids had been polite and curious and a little bit nervous, and the visit had ended with everyone still intact. Sarah was not ready to call it a reconciliation. She did not know if she would ever be ready to call it that, but it was something. Sarah and Marisol had stayed in close touch the whole time, of course. Marisol had visited Briarcliff 3 times in the first year. She had brought her daughter, who Lily adored, and they had stayed at the Victorian for long weekends, eating Sarah's cooking and helping with the garden and lying on the floor of the sitting room with the kids playing board games. Sarah had told Marisol about the money, not the exact number, because there was no need to put that on anyone, but enough that Marisol had understood the scope of what had happened. Marisol had cried. Then she had laughed. Then she had cried again. And then she had hugged Sarah and told her, with the fierce loyalty of a friend who had been there for the worst years, that Sarah deserved every penny and more. Sarah, on one of Marisol's visits, had offered her a piece of the windfall, not as a loan, as a gift. Marisol had refused, the way Sarah had known she would. Marisol was proud and self-sufficient, and she would not take money she had not earned. But Sarah had insisted on at least paying for Marisol's daughter's college, in a fund that Sarah set up quietly without telling Marisol the full extent, and Marisol had eventually accepted that, after a lot of arguing, because Marisol could not, in the end, deny her own daughter that kind of opportunity. The two women had sat on the porch swing of the Victorian on the last night of one of Marisol's visits, drinking wine, watching the stars come out over the hills, and Marisol had said, quietly, that she had never been so glad in her life to see someone get what they deserved. Sarah had not been able to answer that. She had just reached over and held Marisol's hand, and they had sat there in the dark for a long time. Two women who had been friends through the worst years and were now going to be friends through the better ones. The hidden room behind the mirror became something different over time. After Sarah had moved most of the valuables out of it, into safety deposit boxes and investment accounts and college funds, the room stood mostly empty. Sarah kept the desk and the leather chair and the cabinet with the empty glass doors. She kept the lamp with the green shade. She kept the ledgers, all of them, because the ledgers were a record of her grandfather and her grandmother and their whole strange, careful life, and Sarah was not going to discard that. She added her own ledger to the shelf, a new leather-bound book in which she kept her own records of where the money was now and of every donation she made and of every check she wrote to local causes. She wrote in it once a week, on Sunday afternoons, while the kids did their homework downstairs. She made notes in the same careful handwriting her grandmother had used. She suspected, sometimes, that Eleanor was watching her from somewhere, and that Eleanor was proud. She suspected, other times, that this was a comforting story she was telling herself, and that the dead did not really watch the living, and that it didn't matter either way because the work was the work and it needed to be done. Either way, the room became Sarah's office, her thinking room, her quiet place. She would sit at the desk on Sunday afternoons and write in her ledger and look out the small round window at the back garden, where the maple tree was bigger than it had been a year ago, and the vegetable beds were full of tomatoes and beans, and the kind of greens that Sarah's grandmother had once grown in the same soil. She told Marcus about the room when he was 12. He was old enough by then, and he had earned it, with the way he had grown into the kind of careful, watchful young man that Sarah had always hoped he would become. She took him up to her grandmother's bedroom one Sunday afternoon. She had him stand in front of the mirror. She told him the story. She showed him the door. She let him walk into the hidden room, where she had been writing in her ledger for several years by then, and she told him everything. About Eleanor. About the money. About the choices Sarah had made. About why she had kept it a secret. Marcus listened, the way he always listened, with his whole attention. When she was done, he looked at her for a long moment. He asked her one question. He asked her if she had ever been tempted to spend it all on big things, on cars and houses and trips. Sarah laughed. She said yes. Of course she had been tempted, and that she had bought some things for them, and that there was nothing wrong with spending money on what mattered. But she had wanted, more than anything, to keep their family the kind of family who knew what mattered, and she had been worried that throwing the money around would make them forget. Marcus nodded. He said he understood. He said he wouldn't tell anyone. Sarah said she trusted him. Marcus, for the first time in years, hugged her. He was almost as tall as she was by then. He smelled like the soap she had been buying for him for months. She held him for a long time, her oldest son, who was not a baby anymore, who was almost a young man, and who was going to be okay in this world because she had given him a foundation strong enough to stand on. Emma found out when she was 14. It happened by accident. She was looking for an old music book that Mr. Holmgren had told her had belonged to Eleanor, which Sarah had said she could check the upstairs bedroom for, and Emma had gone into Eleanor's old room and had decided, for reasons even she could not explain, to take down the big mirror to see what was behind it. She found the door. She found the hidden room. Sarah had been at the diner, finishing a shift. She got a phone call from Marcus, who said Emma had found the room and was waiting for Sarah to come home. Sarah drove home with her heart in her throat. She found Emma sitting in the leather chair, with the lamp on, reading one of Eleanor's old ledgers, looking up at Sarah with eyes that were full of questions but not full of accusation. Sarah sat down across from her, and she told Emma the whole story too. Emma listened. Emma did not interrupt. When Sarah was done, Emma asked if some of the music in the room had been her great-grandmother's. Sarah said yes, that there were some old books on the shelf in the cabinet, that Emma was welcome to take any of them. Emma's whole face lit up in a way that made Sarah's chest hurt with love. Emma went to the cabinet. She found the music. She found pieces that her great-grandmother had played, that her great-grandfather had bought for her great-grandmother on anniversaries, that had been waiting in that hidden room for someone in the family who could read music again. Emma sat down at the floor of the hidden room and went through every single book. She found a piece, a Chopin nocturne, that had a note from her great-grandfather written in the margin. To my Eleanor. From your Robert. With love, always. Emma traced the words with her finger. She looked up at Sarah, and her eyes were full of tears, and Sarah's eyes were full too. The two of them sat there in the hidden room for a long time. 2 generations of women holding the music of the 2 generations before them, and Sarah understood, in that moment, that this was what her grandmother had meant. This was what she had been waiting for. Not just the money, the continuation, the passing down, the making sure that the family she had built would keep going, in better forms, in stronger forms, in forms that did not have to hide behind mirrors anymore. Lily, who was 7 by then, was not told for several more years. She was too young to keep a secret. Sarah waited until Lily was old enough, and then she told her too, and Lily had listened with the wide-eyed wonder of a child being let in on a family mystery, and she had immediately wanted to know if there were any pieces of jewelry left that she could try on. Sarah had laughed. Sarah had taken her to the bank that weekend, and she had let Lily try on the emerald necklace, just for a minute, in the private viewing room of the safety deposit box. Lily had looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall and had announced that she felt like a queen. Sarah had told her she was. Sarah had told her that all 3 of them, Marcus and Emma and Lily, were her treasures, and that the jewels in the bank were not nearly as important. Lily had nodded, the way only a small girl can nod when she is trying to be very serious about something, and then she had taken the necklace off and helped Sarah put it back in the case. They had walked out of the bank together, holding hands, and Lily had asked if they could get ice cream. They had. They had gotten the biggest scoops the shop had, 2 scoops each, 1 strawberry and 1 chocolate, and they had eaten them sitting on a bench in the park while the autumn leaves fell around them. Sarah had thought, sitting there with her youngest daughter and a melting ice cream cone, that she had finally arrived at the life she had been working toward her entire life. She had not gotten here in the way she had expected. She had not gotten here through hard work alone, although she had worked hard. She had not gotten here through her own merit, although she had earned the trust her grandmother had placed in her. She had gotten here through the long, patient love of a woman who had spent 40 years waiting to give her granddaughter a chance. And Sarah was not going to waste a single day of it. Years later, when Marcus was in college and Emma was preparing for her senior recital at the conservatory she had eventually attended on a partial scholarship that Sarah had not let the family pay for entirely because Emma had wanted to earn some of it herself, and Lily was just starting high school and was already taller than her mother, Sarah would still go up to the hidden room on Sunday afternoons. She would write in her ledger. She would think. She would look out the small round window at the maple tree, which was huge by then, with branches that reached past the bedroom windows. She would remember Eleanor. She would remember her grandfather, whom she had never met, who had brought home a fortune from a dangerous country and had hidden it behind a mirror and had left it for the right person to find. She would remember the woman she had been on the morning of that phone call from Mr. Pemberton, sitting in her cramped apartment with a cold cup of coffee and 3 children to raise. She would remember how scared she had been, how tired, how sure she was that she was failing at everything. She would think about the version of herself that had answered the phone anyway, the version that had driven up to Briarcliff in a dying Honda, the version that had walked into the blue Victorian and seen, even through the dust and the peeling paint, the home it could become. She would say a silent thank you every Sunday to whichever version of herself had been brave enough to take the chance, and to her grandmother, who had been waiting at the other end of that brave decision with arms full of love and a wooden box full of more than money. The blue Victorian on the edge of Briarcliff was not the biggest house in town. It was not the fanciest. The wealthy people in the region tended to live in newer construction up by the lake, with their landscape lawns and their professional designers and their gardens that bloomed on schedule. Sarah's house was tilted slightly to the east, the way old houses get when they have settled into the ground over 100 years. The porch swing she had bought to replace the sagging one had developed its own creak. The garden, which Sarah tended herself on weekends, was the kind of mixed-up tangle that gardeners with too much enthusiasm and not enough planning always create. But the house was full of music on the days Emma was home. It was full of books in every corner Marcus had claimed. It was full of light in the rooms Lily had painted herself when she was old enough. And it was full, most importantly, of the kind of life that Sarah's grandmother had been waiting to make possible. The neighbors knew Sarah. The town knew her. She was the woman who waited tables at Patty's Diner some mornings, even though everyone in town suspected by then that she did not have to. She was the woman who paid for the music program at the elementary school, and the new fire truck, and the renovation of the library, all anonymously, although the secret had gradually become a kind of open one, the way secrets become in small towns over time. People did not press her about it. People let her have her dignity. And in return, she did not stop. She did not stop giving. She did not stop showing up to her shift at the diner. She did not stop being the kind of neighbor who would drop off a pot of soup if she heard someone was sick, who would shovel the elderly Mrs. Patterson's driveway if she saw her struggling, who would slip an envelope of cash into the mailbox of a family she heard was struggling to pay for a child's medical bills. She did all of this not because she had to. She did it because she could. She did it because she had been on the other side of those small kindnesses for so many years, and she knew what they meant, and she knew what they could change. The mirror still hung in the bedroom that had been Eleanor's, the bedroom that Sarah had eventually moved into after a few years, when she felt ready. The mirror was the same mirror her grandmother had hung over the door. Sarah had cleaned it, restored it gently, and put it back in its place. The door behind it remained, although Sarah no longer kept it locked. The hidden room was her office now, used freely, with the door cracked open most of the time. The kids knew about it. They came in sometimes when they wanted to talk to her about something important. Marcus had come in the day before he left for college to thank her, properly, for everything she had done for him. Emma had come in the night before her first piano recital to play, very softly, on the small electronic keyboard Sarah kept in the corner, the same nocturne her great-grandfather had given her great-grandmother. Lily had come in dozens of times over the years, to sit on the floor and color and ask her mother questions about every subject under the sun. The mirror, looking down on all of this, had become a kind of family witness. It had hidden so much for so long, and now it hid nothing. And that, Sarah thought sometimes, was its own kind of healing. The secret had served its purpose. The secret was no longer needed. The truth, in this house, was now free to walk around in the daylight, as it should be. On the 10th anniversary of Sarah's first drive up to Briarcliff, she went up to the cemetery alone. The kids were grown enough now that they did not need to be brought. Marcus was studying engineering at the same university his great-grandfather had attended, which Sarah had not pushed, but which had felt right to all of them. Emma was 18 and starting at a conservatory in Boston. Lily was 11 and at home with Marisol, who had moved up to Briarcliff 3 years earlier and bought a small house 2 streets over, because she had said she was tired of the city and wanted to grow old somewhere quiet. Sarah drove to the cemetery in the late afternoon, with a bouquet of flowers she had cut from her own garden, and she sat down on the grass in front of her grandmother's headstone, and she told Eleanor everything that had happened over the past decade. The donations she had made, the kids' accomplishments. Margaret, who was still sober, who had moved closer to Briarcliff a few years back and was a regular, if distant, part of the kids' lives. Vivian, who had passed away 2 years ago without ever reconciling with Sarah. Robert, who had finally moved on to other family members to torment and had not been heard from in years. The diner, where Sarah still worked a couple of mornings a week because she loved Patty and she loved the regulars and she loved the smell of bacon and coffee and the morning light coming through the windows. The hidden room, which had become her office. The mirror, which still hung where Eleanor had hung it. The whole long, careful, unhurried unfolding of the life that Eleanor had set in motion the day she had signed her will and left everything to Sarah. Sarah sat in the grass, and she talked to her grandmother until the sun started going down. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about Eleanor years ago. The grief had not gone away, but it had settled into something steadier. A kind of ongoing conversation. A presence. Sarah suspected that for the rest of her life, she would talk to Eleanor like this, on the anniversary, on Christmas mornings, on the days when one of the kids did something amazing. She would keep her grandmother in her life that way. It would have to be enough, because it was all there was. But it was, Sarah had come to understand, plenty. She got up eventually. She brushed the grass off her jeans. She kissed her fingers and pressed them to the headstone. She walked back to her car, which was now a sensible Subaru that she had bought used the year before, after the Honda had finally given up the ghost. She drove home through the late summer evening, with the windows down and the radio off, and she passed the diner and waved to Patty, who was closing up for the day, and she passed the elementary school where Emma had played her first piano recital, and she passed the library where Marcus had read every book in the children's section before he was 9, and she turned up the long gravel driveway of the blue Victorian, where the porch lights were already on and Marisol's car was parked under the maple tree. Sarah parked. She got out. She stood for a moment, looking at the house, at the wraparound porch, at the windows lit warm against the gathering blue of evening, at the turret on the left side, which gave the house the look of a small, dignified castle. She thought about the woman she had been, 10 years ago, on the morning of that phone call. The woman who had been so tired, so afraid, so sure she was never going to get out from under the weight of her life. Sarah thought about her, and she sent her a small, silent message across the years. She told her younger self that it was going to be okay, that she was going to be brave when it mattered, that she was going to answer the phone and drive up to Briarcliff and find a house full of secrets, and she was going to handle every one of those secrets with grace, and she was going to come out the other side as the woman she had always been meant to be. The woman her grandmother had seen when nobody else had. The woman who was finally fully home. She walked up the porch steps. She opened the door. Inside, she could hear Lily laughing at something Marisol had said. She could smell whatever Marisol had cooked for dinner, garlic and tomato, and something good. She could see the soft light from the lamp in the sitting room, the one she had bought to replace the dusty old one. She closed the door behind her. She hung her keys on the hook in the entryway. She walked into her home, the home her grandmother had built and held and saved for her, and she let it hold her, the way only a real home can hold a person. The mirror upstairs, in the bedroom that had been Eleanor's, caught the light from the hallway and threw it back in a soft, warm glow. The hidden room behind it stood empty and waiting for the next Sunday afternoon, when Sarah would sit at the desk and write in her ledger and look out at the maple tree and continue, in her own small way, the long quiet work her grandmother had passed down to her. And so the story comes to its quiet end, where every story like this deserves to end. Not with a fortune, although there was a fortune. Not with a vindication, although there was vindication. But with a mother and her children, and a house with light in its windows, and the memory of a grandmother who had loved her enough to wait. A grandmother who had hidden the truth behind a mirror, and had trusted, all those long years, that someone would one day be brave enough, and good enough, to bring it back into the light. 15 more years passed before Sarah did the one thing she had been quietly preparing to do for most of her adult life. She did it on a cold January morning, sitting at the desk in the hidden room behind the mirror, with a fresh leather-bound notebook in front of her and a fountain pen she had bought herself for her 50th birthday. The notebook was identical to the one her grandmother had used. Sarah had found a stationer in Boston who still made them by hand, with the same paper, the same binding, the same small ribbon stitched into the spine to mark her place. She had bought 4 of them. One was for her ledger, which she had been keeping for 25 years by then. The other 3 were for the children. Marcus, who was 33. Emma, who was 31. Lily, who was 28. 3 notebooks, one for each of them. And on that January morning, with snow falling outside the small round window, Sarah opened the first of the 3 notebooks and began to write. The letter to Marcus took her most of the day to compose. She wrote it slowly, with breaks for tea, with the heat turned up in the hidden room because her bones felt the cold more than they used to. She told him about his great-grandfather, about the work he had done overseas, about the choices he had made and the reasons for them. She told him about the long, careful life Eleanor had built around the secret, and about the morning Sarah had finally found the courage to take down the mirror. She told him about the choices she had made in the years since. She told him about the donations, all of them, with the kind of specificity she had never shared with anyone. She told him where every account was, who managed each one, which lawyer he should contact when the time came, which bank held which safety deposit box. She told him the names of the pieces of jewelry that were still in the family's possession and the appraised values, and her thoughts on which ones should stay in the family and which ones, when the time was right, should be sold and turned into more good in the world. She told him she trusted him to make those decisions when she could no longer make them herself. She told him she loved him, and that she had loved him from the moment she had first held him in a hospital room in the city, on a hot June afternoon, when she had been 21 years old, and so terrified she had not been able to feel her own hands. She told him that he had been the reason she had kept going through the hardest years, that the weight of him on her chest in those first sleepless weeks had been the only thing that had given her any sense of purpose, and that watching him grow into the man he had become had been the greatest privilege of her life. She wrote Emma's letter the following day. Emma was a concert pianist by then, married to a cellist she had met at the conservatory, with 2 children of her own and a third on the way. Emma lived in Vermont, in a farmhouse she and her husband had bought together, where she taught lessons in the front parlor and rehearsed in the converted barn out back. Sarah's letter to Emma was different from the one she had written to Marcus. She told Emma about the music, about all of it, about the book she had found in the cabinet and the note in the margin of the Chopin Nocturne, and what that note had meant to Eleanor and what it had come to mean to Sarah. She told Emma that the piano in the sitting room downstairs, which was now nearly 30 years old and which Sarah had been having tuned twice a year by the same man for all of those years, would be hers when Sarah was gone. She told her that Eleanor's old music, the original copies, the ones with the markings in her great-grandparents' handwriting, were preserved in acid-free folders in the cabinet of the hidden room, and that Emma should know they were there, waiting for her, whenever she wanted them. She told her about the grief that came with being a musician, about the way music made people feel everything more sharply than they wanted to, and she told her that this had been her great-grandmother's gift to her, and that Emma had carried it forward more beautifully than Sarah could have imagined. She told her she was proud of her, in a way she had perhaps not said directly enough over the years. She told her she was sorry for the times she had been too tired to come to a recital, too distracted to listen to a piece Emma had wanted to play for her, too caught up in her own work to fully see how much music meant to her middle daughter. She asked Emma to forgive her for those small failures. She told her she loved her, and that whenever Emma sat at a piano, anywhere in the world, Sarah would be sitting with her. Lily's letter took the longest. Sarah worked on it for almost a week. Lily was a teacher, working with children with reading difficulties, the same way Marcus had once needed help and had received it. She lived in Briarcliff. She had moved back after college, into a small house 3 blocks from the diner, and she came to the Victorian every Sunday for dinner with Sarah, who was alone in the big house now that the others had moved on. Lily was the one Sarah saw most often. Lily was the one who knew the most about Sarah's daily life, about the quiet routines, about the way Sarah liked her coffee in the mornings. And so Sarah's letter to Lily was, in some ways, the most difficult, because there was so much that Lily already knew and so much that still needed to be put down on paper. Sarah wrote about the way Lily had been the one to absorb the new life most completely, about how Lily had no real memory of the apartment, of the cold winter mornings, of the upstairs neighbors fighting through thin walls, about how Sarah had sometimes worried that Lily would not understand the value of what she had, because she had never been without it, about how, over the years, Sarah had watched Lily prove her wrong, again and again. Lily had grown up to be the kind of woman who noticed when other people were struggling, who carried groceries for elderly neighbors, who tutored kids in her classroom on her own time after school. Lily had absorbed not the comfort but the spirit of the home Sarah had built. She had absorbed Eleanor's example without ever having met Eleanor. She had become, in her own quiet way, the next link in a chain that Sarah was now writing down so it would never be lost again. Sarah told her this. Sarah told her that the chain mattered more than the money, and that the money was a tool, and that the tool was useful only in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. Sarah told Lily that she trusted her to know what to do with it. She told her she always had. When the 3 letters were finished, Sarah sealed them in envelopes. She did not give them to her children. She put them in the bottom drawer of the desk in the hidden room, the same drawer where the small velvet pouch with the brass key had once been, and she wrote on the outside of each envelope, in her grandmother's old style, the name of the child it was meant for. She wrote a small note that she placed on top of the 3 envelopes, instructing whichever of them found them first to make sure all 3 got delivered. She closed the drawer. She sat for a long time at the desk, looking out the small round window at the maple tree, which was bigger than ever, its branches reaching higher than the roof now, its trunk thick enough that 2 adults could not get their arms around it together. She thought about the chain of women in her family, her grandmother, who had carried the secret for 40 years. Her own 20-something years of stewardship, which had been shorter but no less consequential. The years to come, when one of her children, or all 3 of them in their own ways, would carry it forward. She did not know how long she had. She was in her late 50s, still healthy, with no immediate reason to think she was running out of time. But the letters had needed to be written. The notebooks had been waiting on her shelf for almost a year, and she had finally felt ready. The work of preparation was done. She closed the hidden room. She replaced the mirror, which she did less often these days but still did sometimes, on the days when she wanted the bedroom to look ordinary, the way it had looked when she had first walked into it almost 30 years ago. She went downstairs. She made herself a simple dinner, the way she did most nights now. She ate it at the kitchen table, with the radio on softly in the background, listening to a classical station she had grown to love. After dinner, she pulled on her coat and her good winter boots, and she walked out into the backyard, where the snow had finally stopped falling. The sky had cleared. The moon was almost full. The snow on the ground was the kind of fresh, soft white that looked blue under the moonlight, and the maple tree stood black against the sky with its bare branches catching the light. Sarah stood in her backyard for a long time. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about her grandfather, whom she had never known. She thought about the long, patient work of a family carrying something forward across generations, even when nobody knew that was what was happening. She thought about the day she had taken down the mirror, The night she had found the door, the moment she had opened the box and seen the cash and known, with absolute certainty, that everything was about to change. She thought about the woman she had been then. She felt very tender toward that woman. She wanted to reach back across the years and tell her, again, that she was going to be okay, that the brave choice she had made would carry her forward into a life she could not yet imagine, that her children would be safe, that her grandmother had been right about her, that she had been right to trust herself, even when her hands were shaking and her chest was tight with fear and she had no idea what was on the other side of any of it. Sarah stood in the moonlit yard until her cheeks went numb with the cold. Then she turned around. She walked back to the house. She climbed the porch steps. She let herself in, and she closed the door behind her, and she went upstairs to bed, and she slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman who had done her work and could rest. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.